Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's weekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC. My guest today is Shai Akabas. He's director of economic policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In 2010, he staffed the Domenici-Rivlin Debt Reduction Task Force. He's also advised Jerome Powell, now chairman of the Federal Reserve, on debt limit issues. He has an MS in applied economics from Georgetown University. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted online at TPC's website in the near future. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Shai Akabas, welcome to The Prescription.
Thanks for having me, Howard.
Good to see you. So let's get straight to the bottom line. When is the federal government going to breach the debt limit? What's your best guess now?
Sure. So at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we project what we call the X date, which is when we expect the government will be unable to continue meeting all of its obligations as a result of the debt limit. And that would be an unprecedented event, which I'm sure we can come back to. Our current projection is that that will happen sometime between early June and early August. That is a very broad range. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that whenever we're dealing with the debt limit and making projections, there's a lot of uncertainty involved because we're dealing with hundreds of billions of dollars that are coming in and out of the government each month. Some of that is quite predictable, like Social Security benefit payments or other payments that go out on a scheduled basis in a roughly predictable quantity. Others are totally unpredictable. So there are some payments that go out that have very little rhyme or reason in terms of the pattern of how much is going out on any particular day. And on the revenue side, of course, there's massive uncertainty on who's going to pay taxes on each individual day. Now, there are some patterns. And of course, we know during tax season or quarterly tax payments that those are going to go up. So we can predict trends. But on any given day, it's a little bit of a dartboard. So we do our best to try to smooth that out and look at it over a broader period of time. The other element here that is causing such a large range, even though we're approaching the beginning of it, is that early June is going to be a down period. And we're not sure whether or not the Treasury Department is going to have enough room to get through that. If they do get through that period, then they get to June 15th, which is when, of course, quarterly taxes are due. And that will likely float them until the end of the month of June, at which point they get another extraordinary measure that becomes available to them, which will get them sometime into at least July. So we're sort of looking at two ends of the range here. One is this early June period, which the Treasury Secretary has put a focus on with her letter of June 1st. And then if they manage to get through that early June period, then we're looking at sometime towards the latter half of that window that we laid out at the beginning. And we'll have a better sense in the coming days of which one of those worlds we're in, but again, because it's such a close call in early June, we may not know with any certainty until we get quite close.
So the federal government is sort of in a position of a business that's got a terrible cash flow problem, and it doesn't know if it's going to actually make payroll next week or not.
Yeah, I mean, we're skating, regardless of what the situation is, we're going to be skating on thin ice in early June, and we'll figure out how thin. But when you're skating on thin ice, you can always fall through. And I think that is sort of the proposition or the situation we have right now, which is the Treasury Department is not used to operating at very low cash balances and with very limited room for flexibility. So something can always go wrong. I think it's unlikely in the next several days, for example, while these negotiations are ongoing and hopefully completing soon, that something goes wrong. But the further along we go, the more likely it is that those types of really catastrophic events could occur.
So this high level of uncertainty seems to leave the politicians in an unusual spot. Normally, as you know, everybody knows what the deadline is. They negotiate up until the last possible second to squeeze out the best deal they can. But this time, nobody knows when we're going to go over the cliff. So how does that affect these negotiations? Do you think they're sort of operating under the assumption that June 1st is the real date? Or are they still kind of dragging things out because they're not sure?
Yeah, Congress always works better with a deadline. They take all the time that they can. Somebody made the analogy to me that it's sort of like a room with gas expanding to fill it, that they will always do that with the time that is granted to them. And the challenge with the debt limit at the X date is we never know exactly when that's going to happen, unlike a government shutdown or other deadlines that Congress has. So I do think that they are largely operating under that June 1st date now. In fact, just this morning, Speaker McCarthy said that he expects to have something on the floor of the House next week, which would, again, move them in a position where something could, in theory, get to the president's desk by June 1st. That said, June 1st, there's no certainty with respect to that deadline per se. And the Treasury Department has made that very clear, because not even the Treasury Department knows when they're going to run out of cash or run out of room. They have said that June 1st is sort of the first date that they are uncertain through which they could fund all of government operations. They'll have a better sense, as will we, as we get closer to that date. And it's possible things do slip. Having that wiggle room is probably good, because we know that Congress generally can't get something across the finish line from introduction in the House to signature by the president in a 24 or 48-hour period. That's not how our political system is generally designed. But we'll know more about what that timeframe looks like, and how much skepticism there is on the Hill around that June 1st deadline. I think there is already some as we get closer and as we see more about how those cash flows are coming in.
At the beginning of this process, going back a couple of months, there was a lot of, let me put it this way, Republicans in Congress seem to have two different views about the debt limit. One of them was, it's not a big deal. And the other one was, it's a really big deal and we can use it as leverage. Do you get the sense that that first attitude is changing? Are there more people up there who are recognizing the seriousness of this, or do you still think there are a number of House Republicans who just think this is just not a big deal, is overblown?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think most members at this point understand the gravity of the situation. And I've been doing this for a while now, as you know. And so I would say back in 2011, there was much less familiarity with what the debt limit was, what the risks were, what the potential consequences could be. And that's why I think back then you got a lot of members who were saying, under no circumstances will I ever vote to increase the debt limit, because they felt like that was a tenable position. They didn't feel like they had a clear understanding, or maybe they felt like they did, and it was an incorrect clear understanding of what the potential consequences could be. And so that was a very loud sentiment back in 2011. This time around, in contrast, you saw almost every member of the Republican conference in the House vote for a bill that would increase the debt limit. Now, it's not a bill that's going to pass. It has a lot of Republican priorities in it, but there's less of an argument about whether or not the debt limit needs to be increased at all, and more of an argument now as to how. So I think that is progress, that we understand collectively the gravity of the situation that we are in. That doesn't mean that it's a good situation for our country to be in, where every year or two we threaten to not make good on all of our obligations. But I do think that the dynamic up there is a little bit different than it was in the past. I also think that the debate has evolved where more and more members are realizing that this is an unhealthy dynamic, that even in theory, if it can be used to leverage concessions from one side or the other, that it's not how our government should be operating. The reason why it's being used the way that it is because it's the only opportunity to have these broader conversations around the federal budget that is presented, because our budget process is so broken right now in Congress that everybody pretty much agrees on. And that's why we're having the debt limit be the focal point in these conversations. And I think more members on both sides realize that that is both substantively and politically unhealthy, and they're looking for other ways.
So that said, my colleague Len Berman has recently written that one of his fears is that the use of the debt limit as leverage is becoming normalized. That this is going to be, part of the kind of annual fiscal cliff thing that we go through every year. Do you share that concern?
I think it already has been, frankly. That's what we've seen over the last decade. And it's interesting that both sides have their very clear narratives about the situation, and they overlook elements that I think are compelling on the other side that make this ultimately, I think, largely a substantive and political wash. So there's really I don't think it is really in anybody's best interest for the debt limit to be the focal point of our fiscal policy, but both sides tend to see it through their own lens. And that's why we end up staying stuck in the situation that we're in. So for example, I think Republicans who feel like this is used as leverage, and frankly, Democrats overlook this point as well, overlook the fact that during the Trump administration, there were regular budget agreements on the debt limit. So it was a negotiation to increase federal spending associated with the debt limit. And that was worked out between both sides. Democrats clearly wanted to increase spending and non-discretionary spending. Some would argue that Republicans were very receptive to that as well. And the tendency on both sides is to go for increased spending. But there have always been in recent years negotiations over the debt limit, regardless of what the talking points are on both sides. But often those are to increase spending rather than reduce spending. And frankly, that is working against the fiscal responsibility or the sort of theory that the debt limit serves as a vehicle to really generate the savings that we're not getting in other places. Sometimes we've seen that on occasion, like most recently, all the way back in 2011, where there was the Budget Control Act. I would argue that legislation proved highly unsuccessful, both in terms of the way that it addressed government spending and in terms of controlling the fiscal trajectory that we are on and we know is such a large problem. So for all those reasons, substantively, I think that both parties should be interested in finding a different paradigm because it's not really achieving anybody's goals on the substance. And I don't think it is on the politics either, because it ends up being a lot of finger pointing. It makes everybody look bad and we don't really get anything to show for it.
So bottom line, should we just repeal it?
You know, this gets back to part of the problem, which I think Democrats for the past several years have been so focused on repealing the debt limit entirely, which is just a political non-starter. It is not going to happen. There has not been a single Republican that has been open to that possibility. And I see it from their perspective, which is if we just get rid of this and we don't have any replacement, then we're going to go back to an even worse budget situation where the budget process is broken and we have no opportunity to raise these issues. And so I can empathize with that. I don't think it means that we should stick with the current system that we have, which is dysfunctional and puts our economy at risk time after time. But I think Democrats should in the past have been more receptive, and maybe some of them are coming around to it, to a reform to the debt limit that both takes away the risk, de-risks that process, and adds an alternative process that is much more focused on the substance of fiscal responsibility, where there is that opportunity for members of Congress to put forward reforms and have them actually voted on the floor that would create a more fiscally responsible environment. And, you know, ultimately the budget process should be creating that, but it's not. And I don't foresee a situation where the entire budget process is going to be repaired in the next year or two. So we're forced to look at alternative processes that can sort of plug the gap in the meantime, while we think about a whole host of budget reforms that are needed to get the budget process, the fundamental budget process working again.
So Shai, I hate to be a cynic about this. I think we've all watched this movie too many times, but my sense of it is that the budget process reform never works because Congress always gives itself some way out. And if it doesn't really want to deal with the budget, it's not going to deal with the budget, no matter what the process is. Am I overly cynical about that?
No, I think you are generally right and characterize the vast majority of budget process reforms that we've seen either enacted or attempted in recent years. I would argue that there's a difference in a bill that's been out there for the past few years on a bipartisan basis called the Responsible Budgeting Act. The difference with that bill is that it doesn't actually guarantee any outcome. And the problem with a lot of these other reforms is that it forces Congress's hand, which is always very difficult to bind a future Congress, as everybody knows. And what happens when you try to do that is everybody agrees that the binding is a bad idea and they just wiggle out of it, as you said. The key distinction here is that there is no guaranteed outcome to the process reform and this new process that would be set up that would guarantee debate and ultimately a vote on alternative deficit reduction matters. That could go through and there is no majority for any deficit reduction legislation, and you come back and do that again the next year. Mm-hmm. But what it would require is attention on the issue. And so I think that sort of gets at this key balance, which is when you put in place automatic cuts, sequesters, all those sorts of things, nobody thinks it's a good idea. It always gets turned off or it gets rolled back. And some of the cuts go into effect on an inefficient basis. So we're cutting programs that shouldn't be cut and not cutting programs where there's waste. And what this model tries to do is guarantee that Congress is going to have to focus on this issue and ultimately vote on this issue, but not require that there be an outcome. So if you get into that paradigm, I think the proposition of or the rationale for going to such ends to turn it off is not as appealing, because you have to go through an argument and a negotiation on both sides of turning off something that's not even going to necessarily result in anything anyway, other than a discussion. So I think it becomes more of that recurring opportunity to talk about these issues that both sides frankly should want, but certainly the Republicans have been calling for many years, and doesn't ultimately guarantee that anything is going to go into effect, and frankly wouldn't guarantee that anything that the minority party in the Senate, which, the minority party in either house, wouldn't want to go into effect, because there will be that continued filibuster check, the 60 votes in the Senate that is in place today for all typical legislation. All it's requiring is that there be consideration of these deficit reduction reforms.
Mhm. So let me walk you through some of the options that are out there, maybe from the sublime to the ridiculous, but we'll go through some of them real quick and give me your sense of whether they make any sense. So let's start with the $1 trillion coin. Is that a solution to this problem?
So I might head off some of your questions, although I'm happy to answer each of them sequentially in sort of lumping these all into a category. And certainly they have different merits and different legal rationales. And I'm not a lawyer, let me preface by saying that. I think, though, the question really is less of a legal one around most of these innovative ideas, let's say, and more about the economic risks, because I think that the markets are going to get their say long before the courts do in any of these scenarios. The courts will be an important component, and whether or not it's ruled legal or constitutional is going to matter. But I think if the Treasury Department embarks on any of these scenarios, and let's start with a $1 trillion coin, where there is a loophole theoretically in legislation that was enacted many years ago, where Treasury can basically print currency of any denomination for I'm forgetting the word, but basically token commemorative purposes, and it could be used as currency, and they would do one in the form of a $1 trillion coin, which would buy us lots of additional time on the debt limit, which could be deposited with the Federal Reserve. Now, with this one, the first thing is the Federal Reserve would have to accept that deposit from the Treasury Department. And I know that Chairman Powell would be reluctant to get involved in this way in the political situation, and in what it could appear like the Federal Reserve is sort of monetizing the federal debt that we have, or sort of permitting that ultimately political decision to go forward, or I guess being viewed as facilitating it, I should say. But putting that aside, let's just assume that goes through. I think the appearance of the United States printing a $1 trillion coin to get out of its economic/political problems, first of all, puts us in the world with puts us in the category with, undeveloped countries that do not have industrialized systems like we have, modern economies that are the bulwark of the global financial system. We would look like a banana republic if we're printing $1 trillion coins. Yes, that's, it's better to look like a banana republic than to default on your debt. So I fully acknowledge that. But I think that the risks that are associated with that, from credit rating agencies, from investors in US Treasury securities, financial markets, various individuals and businesses that are involved in the economy, there's a lot of unpredictability there. And once that spiral starts, I fear that it's going to be hard to undo. If you look at the banking system situation that we've had in recent days, often it's one or a group of several investors in a bank that say something fishy is going on here, don't like the way this looks, and they pull their money out, they tweet it out to their 1 million followers, and they all start doing the same. And within a week, the bank is insolvent. And no matter what the leaders of the bank say, you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. So I fear that we could see that situation at the federal government level. Now, they're not 100% equivalent. I'm not trying to say that they're the same. We're going to go bankrupt as a country. But I think that you could have a series of economic consequences that cascade very quickly in a way that nothing the Treasury Secretary says or that Congress or other leaders say can really undo the damage. And that is really my fear with all of these scenarios, is that it is unprecedented, highly unpredictable, and the risks that we would be taking going down that road are quite significant. Again, I think most of them probably are better than actually defaulting on our debt, but that's a pretty low bar.
So you make the same argument about the 14th Amendment? Basically.
Yeah, again, it ultimately could be a year down the road that the courts rule that is permissible, but in particular with that, and I think it also applies, frankly, to the $1 trillion coin, if the US government is embarking on something that is at least able to be questioned in court, where new debt that the government is issuing could be invalidated by an injunction from any court around the country that says, you are in violation of the debt limit, this debt that you've issued in excess of the debt limit is at least put on hold for now. What are investors in that debt going to do? I mean, I wouldn't want to be the one that's holding that security that a court could say, well, this security is not going to be paying any interest until we get to a year down the road and this legal case is resolved, I think you'd see very high interest rates at a minimum on securities that are auctioned off in that environment. And that could lead to unforeseen consequences. So I think it leads us down a road that we don't want to go down as a country, where we could really be in uncharted waters and we don't know what that looks like. Again, I would say better than actually defaulting on the debt, but I don't think that it is a clear answer to the current situation. And I think that's why Treasury secretaries in the past have been so reluctant to take that route, and why Secretary Yellen describes it. She sort of used artful language around it, but the way that she's put it, which I think is a reasonable way to describe the situation, is that Congress taking action is the only way that we can guarantee to avoid the worst risks and consequences associated with the debt limit. Because any of these other worlds, the coin, the 14th Amendment, premium bonds, whatever you want to come up with, prioritization, none of that is guaranteed to avoid some of these really horrific consequences. And so the only world we know is Congress taking action. And that's, of course, what she has been encouraging.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the market hates uncertainty. This would create a lot of uncertainty, and we would end up paying the price with higher interest rates.
Yeah, and I think, the Treasury Department is known as sort of the most predictable actor in the entire global financial system, and anything that corrupts that reputation could have really both short-term consequences in terms of what that fallout looks like, but also long-lasting consequences. And if I'm a credit rating agency, I mean, if the Treasury Department's issuing debt that might be invalidated by any court around the country, you have to take some action in response to that. I mean, it would be irresponsible for them to continue rating that as AAA when overnight that security could be invalidated and basically defaulted on. So, what effects that have, what second order effects their downgrades might have, is really a huge open question.
Let me switch gears a little bit and ask you about some of the ideas that seem to be coming out of the negotiations, at least based on the leaks that we've heard. So one of them is this argument over spending caps. And it appears that one of the issues is the length of time that the caps would be in effect. And, I sort of watched this, and again, we've seen this movie before, and sooner or later, these caps all get breached. Does it really matter very much at this point, whether they agree to a 10-year cap or a 5-year cap or a 2-year cap? Does it really make any difference?
I agree with you. I think there's probably a little too much focus put on that element of the solution. And what I would contend is that the most important element here, and this is something I've heard others emphasize too, is that whatever caps are agreed to be realistic. The caps that were put in place in 2011 were intentionally designed to be highly unrealistic, which is why we got stuck with sequester and then a decade's worth of debates and rollbacks of things that never should have been in effect in the first place. And so I think if you want to have a caps regime that is actually effective at making sure our spending isn't growing too quickly, it should be a level that both sides think is reasonable, if not their first desired outcome, and then growing at a rate that all else equal, or under a baseline scenario, both sides can live with. Obviously, there are unforeseen circumstances. Maybe they agree to increase them modestly over time, but having that kind of constraint generally, I think, is a good thing, as long as it is a realistic constraint and more of sort of a benchmark as to where you're headed, and a default, not to use that word in another context, a default scenario, rather than something that is already assumed from the get-go by both sides to be an unrealistic starting point that is going to need to be increased over time. So that's, I think, the right approach there. And I also think it's important to acknowledge that this should not be the main focus of our fiscal solutions, as I know you have talked about with many of your guests over time on this program, that really the drivers here are the entitlement programs on the spending side and the lack of sufficient revenue to fund them. And so we need more of our attention to be focused on those parts of the budget.
And of course, it's interesting that neither of those topics seems to be subject for discussion in the current negotiations.
Ironically, both sides have taken them off the table.
Right. I'm not sure it's an irony. I'm not sure quite what it is, but and it's interesting to me too that so much of what they are arguing about has very little to do with material reducing the deficit. I mean, we're talking about permitting reform, and even enhanced work requirements for safety net programs. Is my understanding is would have very little effect on the budget deficit. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding too. And ultimately these deals, and because Congress is not very efficient at taking on individual pieces of legislation, these large bills, whether it's associated with the debt limit or the omnibus appropriations bills or other deadlines, tend to be where a lot of this stuff gets thrown in. The work requirements thing, I think, is closely related to fiscal policy. So it's not strange necessarily that you would see that looped into a budget deal. The permitting thing may be a little bit more distant from that, but we at BPC have been very strong proponents of the need for permitting reform. We actually just had John Podesta here last week from the administration talking about their priorities, and think that there's a lot of common ground that can be had. So, all the better if they can find compromise on even tangentially related issues like that to move forward. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I say ironic in terms of why that they're not dealing with those things, because ultimately this is supposed to be about fiscal responsibility and controlling the trajectory here. But the biggest pieces of that problem have been ruled off the table. So we're stuck with sort of the remainder, which is, again, not the driver. But yeah, I mean, I think that those are the components of what seems like it's shaping up to be the likely place where they'll land right now. And we'll see what else gets thrown on the table. But on the work requirement side, I think you're right. It would probably have perhaps modest budgetary savings, but some of those savings would likely be achieved by kicking people off of the programs who should be eligible even under a work requirements regime, but are not able to jump through all the hoops to get there, which I think is a real problem that we have in our benefit system, that it is so difficult to access the benefits even for people who should in theory be eligible for them.
The other issue that I can't get out of my head is here we are talking about the importance of deficit reduction, yet right around the corner, there is this great interest in actually cutting taxes even more. Republicans have ready to go a bill that would restore some of the tax benefits that were repealed, the corporate tax benefits repealed in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Republicans want to restore or continue the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act individual tax cuts. President Biden has said so does he. CBO just told us that's going to cost another $3.5 trillion. So, I mean, we seem to be in this environment where politicians, as usual, hope that everybody's got a short memory. So we're going to have a debate over, the next few weeks over the importance of deficit reduction, and then we're going to turn around and cut taxes some more.
Yeah, it's a real problem. And this is not a new problem, as you know very well, Howard. And I think it's hard to see how we get out of this paradigm. There is a natural tendency for both sides to gravitate towards policies that worsen the already problematic trajectory that we're on, rather than look for ways to improve it. And, one way I like to frame it is both sides care more about the debt than the other party's priorities, but less about the debt than their own party's priorities. And so whenever they have the opportunity to drive forward their own agenda, the debt takes a back seat. So we've seen that with, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We've seen that with the American Rescue Plan that the Democrats passed. And you can argue about which side is more responsible. I'm not here to sort of cast relative proportions of blame, but we've seen that pretty consistently with both parties, that when there's the opportunity to increase deficits rather than reduce them, both parties gravitate in that direction. And I don't see any sign of that stopping soon. So I think the best that we can hope for heading towards 2025 and the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is that we'll get both sides working towards at least a relatively fiscally responsible solution there that doesn't just provide a similar amount of tax cuts to what was put into effect then, but at least curbs some of that deficit spending or really reduced revenues that would result from that. Because I think ultimately we actually need more revenue than in the baseline to resolve the current challenges that we have on the fiscal front. And if we only are driving in the opposite direction, then this problem is just going to get more and more difficult to resolve over time. So
it sounds like the best thing you can hope for here is they don't make it worse.
I think that's where we've gotten to effectively is, when you're in the whole stop digging, I don't have a whole lot of optimism that we're going to get a, Simpson Bowles type grand agreement in the next couple of years. But, hopefully we can at least start forcing the conversation around the entitlement programs, which have trust funds that are in real danger over the coming decade. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expiration hopefully serves as, again, that point of opportunity to at least talk about the tax code in ways that we can try to get more revenue out of it.
We are out of time. Shai Akabas, thank you so much for taking a few minutes. I know you're really busy, and let's see what happens in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Howard. Really enjoyed it.
Take care.